briefing on the budget. As you can imagine, for a variety of reasons, some of which are emanating from our nation's capital, there are some interesting edges to what we'll be discussing today. My name is Jennifer Davis Carey. I'm Executive Director of the Worcester Education Collaborative. Let me take a moment to introduce our panel today. Noe Medina is a consultant with Worcester Education Collaborative, and he will be serving as the facilitator. Viviana Abra Hernandez is the new president of Mass Budget. Colin Jones is the Deputy Policy Director for Mass Budget, and Brian Allen, whom I think everyone joining us today knows, is the Deputy Superintendent, Chief Financial Officer, and Chief Operations Officer. He also does welding when necessary. And so we have a lot of expertise here and a lot of stuff to go over. Let me also introduce Diane. Diane, if you could wave, Diane will be providing our Spanish interpretation. So today we are going to be talking about the state context of the Worcester Public Schools budget. Then we'll be going into the local context and the specific Worcester Public Schools budget that Brian and his folks have been working on. And then we will open it up for questions. But before we do all of that, I'd like to invite Viviana to talk a little bit about Mass Budget. And for those of you who are wondering where you have seen Viviana before, Viviana was for many years at Quinsigamond Community College. So Viviana, you have the talking stick.
Thank you, Jennifer, for inviting Mass Budget and Policy Center this evening to talk about the status of K-12 education in Massachusetts, specifically the funding of our public education system. So quickly, Mass Budget is a research and policy and advocacy organization that uses rigorous databases that we are very proud on making sure that the information, the data, the reports that we put out are founded on really rigorous data analysis and data sources. The difference is that we actually do our research and we do our analysis using equity lenses. So what does that mean? That we look at the data and do our analysis, paying attention at how policy decisions, policy makers, policy agendas affect the most vulnerable populations in the Commonwealth. So we are constantly thinking about how the budget of the state, how the legislature approves a budget that finances programs and throughout the Commonwealth, and how they impact our poorest population, our historically marginalized populations, our students of color, and we are really proud of the work that Colin has been doing for several years in Mass Budget. We are a 501c3, so we receive no funding from the government. Our research is funded by organizations, coalitions, partners, and other foundations that are interested in supporting research, policy analysis, and advocacy that centers vulnerable populations, marginalized populations, and the voices of our communities at the forefront of policymaking. Therefore, if you want to make a donation, if you like what we do, go to our website and we are going to be happy for you to just support our work. I am going to introduce Colin Jones, and I want you to know that before I knew everything about mass budget, I knew about Colin. So when I was in the process of applying for this job and I was talking to specifically Sue Mailman and I asked her to be a reference, she said, "Are you going to work for Colin Jones?" And that has been the case. I work for Colin Jones. He is extraordinary in the amount of information he has and how much he knows the K-12 system in Massachusetts. It is impressive. I think that he knows more about K-12 than he knows about Star Wars. And that is to say a lot. So his expertise is on K-12 and higher education, public policy, and finance. He's the Deputy Director for Research and Policy. He has a master's degree in public policy from the Harvard Kennedy School of Economics and a bachelor's in politics from Oberlin College. He's a native of the Pioneer Village of Western Massachusetts, and he lives in Ashland with his wife and his 2 kids. So here is Colin for you.
All right. Well, one quick factual thing. I actually work for Viviana, just looking at the org chart. But yeah, no, so it's been awesome having Viviana, and I was sort of biased that I wanted a new president to come from the education world. So we all got what we wanted here. So yeah, so I before my time as a policy person, I was a extended learning time and after school teacher and a AmeriCorps member. And so I kind of over my career was asking myself, what do I do to make sure that schools like the ones I worked in as an AmeriCorps member have the funding and support they need, and that kind of led over the years to do what I do now. So so what I'm going to do is I'm going to present some slides on the state budget process and how Worcester Public Schools are funded through the state budget. And I'm really going to try to limit myself to like 15 minutes so that we have as much time for Q&A as possible. So without any more delay, let me get that going. Okay. Okay. All right. And also, of course, I'm a fan of Worcester Tech, and I'm a fan of Worcester's transportation contract, bringing those crazy bus contracts onto under the control of smart people like Brian. So yeah. So now I'm tempted to get right into the details and all the spreadsheets and stuff I work on, but I really want to start with, and as we think about the heart and the values that we bring to the budget, we'll start with some of the numbers and stuff, but we'll go back to why it is that we're all doing this. So in terms of the state budget, the way we think about it is, one way to think about it is all the things that go in. So state taxes, you pay a sales tax, you file your taxes every year. That's the biggest part of revenue. There is resources that the state generates by doing things like you got to pay certain fees to get a license or that type of thing. And then there's also, of course, the role of federal funding in supporting the state budget. So those are the inputs of the state budget, and the outputs are programs for schools, housing, environmental programs, parks, roads and bridges, that type of stuff. However, we always think of budgeting as values, and it's what kind of community do we want? What kind of things are so important that we're not going to just leave them up to where you happen to live and just we hope that it'll happen? What are the things that are so important that we have to do them all together through the state government, so through the state budget? So as it's been said, show me your budget and I'll tell you your values. So it's really about what are we prioritizing, and all of us are here tonight because we believe in the fact that regardless of background, regardless of the income and wealth that a particular family has or student has, they should get a world-class education in Massachusetts. And that just that's not something that just happens. It's something we have to work on together. So as far as the revenue pie, this has come up. Of where does the budget come from? As I mentioned, like the sort of traditional taxes, like you're paying your income tax every year, you're paying sales tax on things you buy. Those types of taxes are about 57% of the budget. Um, and then revenue from the federal government, particularly in things like health and transportation, and also to some extent education as well. Federal grants are about a quarter of the budget, and then fees and sort of things like your license fees or things like that are about 10%. And then a lot of kind of fancy new revenue sources that get a lot of news, like the lottery and gaming, gambling, ride share, those kind of new fancy stuff. As cool as it is very cool, but it's sort of a smaller bit of the pie. Okay, so as far as the process, the sort of schoolhouse rock of how the budget works, the steps. So the budget is a uh, cycle, it's a process, and there's different steps along the way. And so this is kind of the cycle, and we're always in some part of it. So right now we had the Governor Healy released her budget in the end of January, and now it is moving towards um, the uh, the State House of Representatives and their budget committee are going to work on their version of it, and that's coming out in about a month. And so when that happens, then the full House of Representatives will sort that out and put different parts on it, and then it will go to the Senate, the state Senate, in May, where they'll do their whole thing, where there'll be the budget committee, then the whole Senate will vote on it, and then the House, our state House and Senate, they have to agree on eventually where we'll go. So they get a 6 members of the House and Senate get in a room and sort out the differences, and they come up with basically like the legislature's consensus version of the budget, and then it'll go. Ideally, it's finished by July 1st. That's when the next fiscal year, so the 2025-2026 budget will start on July 1st, and then we'll proceed. Now, they haven't always been on time recently, so we've needed like an additional month to get that sorted out. But we'll see this time if we can be rolling by July 1st. But so that's the process, and we will be, there's certainly at each step of the process, folks, who want to get involved can speak up and about what they want to see and what they want to get support for, and those types of things. And so when we talk about influencing the budget or speaking out about priorities for Worcester, there's different steps that, where you can, have your voice heard. So in terms of the players involved, this is kind of the org chart here. We have Governor Healy, who runs the executive branch, oversees the state agencies and executing on the budget. Obviously, in education, that's the Executive Office of Education and Secretary Patrick Tutwiler, and then the Department of Elementary and Secondary Ed. So there's different agencies, but we have those are the education-focused ones. And then as far as our State House of Reps, the top leader there is Speaker Ron Mariano. He's from Quincy. And then we have the budget chair, which is called Ways and Means, is Chairman Aaron Michaelwitz from Boston. And then if you look up your legislator from, I used the Worcester Ed Collaborative address. So for that district, the House member is Mary Keefe from Worcester, who's fantastic, and we worked with over the years. Similarly, on the sort of the counterparts on the state Senate, it's the Senate top leader is Karen Spilka, who's also my senator here in Metro West. And then the budget chair is Michael Rodericks from the South Coast, and the Worcester local senator is Robin Kennedy, who's someone we've worked with also really closely and meet with and speak with a lot. So those are the players involved. And as far as just some of the details of what was going on in the education budget this year, so the current school year, also the fiscal year, it's sort of the same calendar. So we had passed a really important K-12 funding legislation called the Student Opportunity Act. And not only were we doing the 4th year of that 6-year plan now, but we also added some additional funds for when we identified more low-income kids, and then there was some additional aid put in for minimum aid, which is sort of for towns that weren't getting a lot of money from the Student Opportunity Act, they still got a little bit of extra funding. One thing we didn't do this year is catch districts up to some of the really, really high inflation and cost growth that has happened in the past 3 years. And I'll say more about that later, but that's just something that, just like everyone else, schools are dealing with really, really high costs in the last few years. On the positive end of things, because voters passed the millionaire tax on the ballot in 2022, we've now had this new revenue source. Again, where millionaires are paying an additional 4% on their income over $1 million, and that's resulting in a lot of new investments, a lot of new programs. And so this year we have free school meals, which is continuing. It started during COVID, but it's continuing because we have these new tax resources. But again, another positive story, at least on the state budget and investment front, is we spent about 1.3 billion of this new progressive millionaire tax in this year, but it has been raising as much as 2.46 billion. So we're not even getting into all the things we can do with this new revenue source. So just in terms of where was all this money going in the budget, it was not just education. There was a mix of different parts of education as well as transportation. So it was kind of a 40% transportation, about 20% to childcare, to K-12, and to public higher education as well. So all of these things were getting part of that new resource. As far as K-12, the K-12 budget itself, this is just, again, right now, 24-25 school year, here's the entire state budget for education. It's about $12.5 billion. A lot of it is the K-12 funding formula. Is about 7 billion. So, obviously the biggest chunk is that formula funding. There's also nearly 3 billion for teacher pensions. When teachers retire, they're in the pension system for our state. And then there's about 1.3 for grant programs like that support special education and after school and a bunch of other things. And also the department itself, the Department of Education and staff, is run out of that orange slice of 1.3 billion. And then there's 1.3 billion for school building assistance. So that's helping cities and towns build new schools. Now, I won't get into this all now, but there's definitely questions about how far that 1.3 billion for school building is going, because these projects have become very, very costly. That's sort of a longer term conversation. So now, I don't expect everyone here in this forum to become a school finance expert. However, hopefully that folks can understand the basics here of how this is the K-12 formula, which is also known as the Chapter 70 formula, how that works, and the basics of it, and also how it's changing after we pass the 2019 Student Opportunity Act. So what I'll do is I'm going to list Worcester's numbers, and this is as of last year because it takes a little while to all those numbers to sort out for the current year. And I'm going to compare Worcester to Northborough, which is sort of one of the suburban districts, and kind of just work through how that formula works and how that results in certain levels of funding for Worcester and Northborough. So there's 4 basic steps of this. So we basically have within the Ed Reform Act of 1993, which was the first kind of big ed reform bill, we created something called the foundation budget, which says this is the minimum that's required to educate kids based on their background and the ages and the different groups of students you have. So for Worcester, and this is 1 year old, this is from last year, the minimum was 18,000 per kid in Worcester compared to about 12,000 in Northborough. And that's reflecting the fact that you've got more English language learners, you've got more low income students in Worcester. And so they're going to require more resources to get them what they need. So then the second step in this process is there is a set percentage of a community's wealth and income that's expected to be able to be given towards, towards the schools. And that is about 4,500 for Worcester compared to about 9,700 for Northborough. So that's just on a per capita basis, there's just much higher wealth and income in Northborough compared to Worcester. So that's how that works. And then the gap between what a city can raise in its local resources and what it needs in its schools is filled by the state progressive state formula funding. So Worcester is getting about $13,500 per kid. This is all per pupil, because obviously Worcester's much larger than Northborough. So Worcester's getting about 13,500 per kid for its schools, where Northborough is getting about 2,600 for its schools. And then last but not least, there's sort of an unofficial step where cities and towns who have the capacity are deciding to sort of use property taxes and other means to put extra funding into their schools. Northborough is putting about $8,700 in this kind of extra spending because they, bless their hearts, they want to add more staff and programs and those types of things. So they put that money in. Worcester's only putting about $74 per kid in that kind of extra spending. So you have a situation where even though the sort of fundamentals of this say Worcester needs to spend more to get kids what it needs, it's actually spending a couple 3,000 less than Northborough. And so or you could say Northborough is spending about 16% more than what Worcester is spending. And this type of issue is why we did the Student Opportunity Act in the first place, to sort of deal with the gaps between cities like Worcester and suburban towns like Northborough. So this was the picture before this. So this, there's still a gap here, but this was the picture before. So Northborough was about 20 points greater in spending a few years ago before we did the Student Opportunity Act. So what the Student Opportunity Act is doing is it's driving that yellow bar of state support for Worcester further up, and it's pushing it's pushing forward what we need to do for Worcester more over time. So again, we're not saying that we expect gateway cities to spend at the same level of their suburbs, but we are moving and closing that gap through state policy and the Student Opportunity Act. So just a little bit about big picture, what we saw in the governor's numbers. It's no longer per student, it's just the entire Worcester budget total. So between what came out in January and the current year, we're expecting about 42 million in more formula funding. And most of it, the really vast majority, 75% of that increase is going to be covered by the state. So that's showing that the Student Opportunity Act is helping the districts that need it the most, and not saying it's solving everything, but it's certainly helping. And then one thing I mentioned was that this was not even accounting for all the inflation that had happened in the past few years. So we did Mass Budget did a study last year looking at this to just show well, how much is the Student Opportunity Act changing and improving things? And then how much more would it be doing if we actually just gave people the full, inflation that's been happening? And what we found was, as of this year, Worcester is getting about $70 million more due to the Student Opportunity Act, but it would be getting another 25 million if we had fully accounted for all the crazy growth and costs that have been going on. And so that's a conversation that is going on with the state and our reps and senators as we talk to them about why they're viewing so much from their schools. One thing we're saying is, well, we didn't fully adjust for all the cost growth that is happening. So that's a real challenge. And of course, I noticed that, that 25 million that Worcester would be getting if we had fully adjusted the aid to inflation is even more than the budget gap that occurred last year. So that certainly had my attention as we think about how this plays out in cities. So in terms of just quickly, before I'll pass it off to Brian, what's going on in the governor's budget and maybe where do we go from here? So This is now going to be year 5 of the Student Opportunity Act. So the proposals, you start the process for the next school year. So 2025-2026 budget. So it'll be year 5 of the 6-year legislative plan. And then sort of to account for some of the crazy cost growth that I mentioned, Governor Healy did include about $275 million for new grants to help districts on things like transportation, special education, and school building, but it wasn't addressing that kind of structural issue of the underinflation. So it's more kind of dealing with the downstream issues of not adjusting people's funding as much as what happened. Positive, one positive thing is that not only are we continuing to do this fair share spending out of the millionaire's tax, but now we're actually starting to adjust to the fact that it's, it's more like, it's, much more than we initially accounted for. So we're using the full amount of $2 billion of this fair share revenue, and then we're also catching up by using some of last year's funding we didn't spend yet. So in terms of what's next, so clearly this is a challenging environment for Worcester Public Schools and a lot of districts. We still need services and support. There's still costs are still very high. We have a lot of things we want to do that in schools it's a personnel business. So if you have things you want to do, it's going to take staff to get done. And we haven't been able to keep all the staff we had during COVID because of a lot of those things expired, the grants expired. So things to think about of what's going to come. Let's fix that inflation problem. Let's correct everything for the crazy inflation that we all experience at the grocery store and other places. Let's get that figured out over the next few years. And then just as was proposed in the governor's budget, we can do some things on grant programs to help all types of districts with all these growing costs as we sort out some of that longer term stuff. But it's been about 10 years since the state examined the entire formula. So there will be things that we'll have to look at longer term over the next 5 years and hopefully we don't have to choose. Let's get cost growth right. Let's get grant programs right. And then let's think long term. So as Viviana mentioned, we have a lot of tools. We have a lot of we have trackers on our website to kind of track the budget process and see how much funding is available. We've got all that stuff is available at massbudget.org. You can sign up for our email list. You can get involved in our events and activities. You can donate, all those things. And so we've been strong friends of the Worcester Education Collaborative for a long time, and we appreciate the opportunity. And we'll stay in the family. So. With that, I will pass it over.
Brian, you have the talking stick.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Colin. I think our two presentations are going to go nicely together. So we're still in the budget development phase, so we don't have a budget recommendation at this point in time. I think our budget goes to the school committee 8 weeks from this coming Friday. So we're still talking to the citywide parent group this week, the high school student advisory group this week. So getting feedback from a bunch of stakeholders. But we're going to use the governor's budget, similar to what Colin just presented, as the basis of our budget for FY26. So thank you, Jennifer, for hosting this on an annual basis. It's great to see some friends, colleagues, and others interested in the Worcester Public Schools budget. So it's very important that this work is shared for the advocacy around the budget and work that still needs to get done. So in the time that I have, which will be about 15 minutes, I think, we'll review the preliminary revenue estimates from the governor's budget, some cost estimates that we're using at this time for next year, some key assumptions and drivers around revenue and cost assumptions, and as I just talked about, some of our next steps. So for those who've seen presentations by the administration, we always link our presentations back to the strategic plan. What is more important than linking resources to the strategic plan? So you'll see really all of the recommendations of the FY26 budget are going to be deeply rooted in the district's strategic plan that was approved about 18 months or so ago, or not even. So Embedded in that, we will, as I said, listen to priorities and input from a wide range of stakeholders, and we'll be connecting the resources. These are the key 6 key priority areas of the strategic plan. And so you'll be seeing resource allocations based upon these 6 key priorities, and then the embedded aims that go along with that. Also, we allocate resources that aligns with the superintendent's annual goals. The 4 goals this year support acquiring and retaining talent, modernize and safe facilities, equitable resources, and educational programs. And among these goals is the allocation of resources through an equity lens. And we'll discuss that more in the upcoming slides. So this slide we use every year and just change it based upon the themes for that coming year. So for FY26, the budget's really going to be framed by these major themes. First, our enrollment increase was fairly robust. We increased 428 students, representing a 3rd year of enrollment increase after 3 consecutive years of enrollment decline. And as we'll see, the enrollment change will directly affect our revenue for next year. The inflation factor used to adjust the foundation budget per pupil rates is moderate at 1.93%, but continues to lag behind actual inflation experience, as Colin just stated. The FY26 governor's budget, it's the 5th year of the funding of the Student Opportunity Act, which was enacted in 2019, continues with this 1/6 phase-in of the target goal rates for next year. We expect the SOA to be fully phased in by next year, FY27. The FY26, as with all annual budgets, will change, reflecting new staff in certain areas, new district initiatives, emerging student and school needs, and adjustments based upon enrollment shifts within the district. We've already begun those conversations with building principals, and as I said, other stakeholders are occurring through the next several weeks. And then, as I said, the FY26 budget, within the available resources, will use an equity-based budget process to align strategic investments to close opportunity gaps for students. So let's kind of jump into some of the numbers. So student enrollment, inflation, and the Student Opportunity Act phase-in are the 3 most important drivers to our annual funding through the state's foundation budget. Enrollment from October 1st is used to determine the foundation enrollment for funding purposes for the following year. As I said, during this year, the increase has seen a 428 student enrollment increase, 1.8% increase from last year. We're still lower than the pre-pandemic high level of 2018, but as I said, this is the 3rd consecutive year of an enrollment increase. The K-6 enrollment increased by 246 students, or 2%, while there was a 107 student decline at the preschool enrollment. And I say this each year, preschool classes generally get filled during the year based upon a number of factors, and October 1 is not a good snapshot for that particular grade level. Middle school enrollment increased 181 students, or 5.5%, and enrollment at the high school level grew by 108 students, or 1.4%. Notable because they are a part of the funding formula that Colin just discussed, we saw a 429 student increase in low-income students, or 2.5%, and a 576 student increase in the number of multilingual learners, or 7.8%. In total, the enrollment is 24,778 students for this year, with increases at each grade configuration level. And so we'll look at kind of the trend in our enrollment on this coming slide. So the Worcester's enrollment outperformed the district's projection this year, notably at the elementary level, and it exceeded our projection by 269 students. And Doherty High had a significant enrollment increase. The 9th grade class at Doherty is 456 students. It's the highest single grade enrollment at the school since 2005. 2 of the last 3 years have seen modest increases at 24,778 students. It matches our average enrollment of the past 15 years. From our 2018 enrollment high of 25,415 students, we decreased 1,680 students in 2021, pandemic related. And while our enrollment has modestly increased in the past 3 years, we're still about 700 students fewer than the 2018 level. Overall, elementary is down 5.7% from that time, but the high school has increased by 3.3%, and middle school has increased 3.5%. Head Start enrollment has decreased by 37%. The second important driver of the foundation budget, as Colin pointed out, is the inflation factor that's used to adjust the per pupil rates annually to reflect increases in spending for state and local governments. Two inflation factors are now used in the foundation budget. One for employee benefits based upon enrollment-weighted 3-year average premium increases for all state group insurance commission plans was 6.13%. And as I said earlier, the inflation factor applied to all the other categories is 1.93%. The overall foundation budget per pupil rates increase due to these two inflation factors totals $12.6 million for next year, which will show is still below our expected cost increases for next year. While we'll see that we don't have a budget gap for next year, we will be using some of our Student Opportunity Act funds to cover the difference of inflation and the amount provided in the inflation of the foundation budget. When we combine the increases in the foundation budget for the enrollment inflation, we can see the significant difference between last year and this year. Last year's enrollment inflation increased the foundation budget by $10 million. And this year, the combined enrollment inflation increase will provide the district with $25.1 million increase, reflecting more than a $15 million increase difference compared to last year. Colin pointed out the Student Opportunity Act. That's the third most important revenue driver within our budget. There are 6 major changes to the foundation budget formula resulting from the SOA. As determined by the state's Foundation Budget Review Commission, the first update is the amount provided for employee benefits and fixed charges. Per pupil rates are adjusted over a 6-year period. Again, using inflation factor more intended to more accurately capture increases in health insurance benchmark against the state's Group Insurance Commission Plan. The SOA also provides funds to expand guidance and school psychological services when districts phased over the 6-year period. The Act increases the amount of funding for the foundation budget for special education out of district tuition, closer to the amount for special education reimbursement, or it's commonly referred to as circuit breaker, as well as increasing the assumed in-district special education enrollments. The largest change for the Student Opportunity Act is the amount of funding for low-income students. We received most of the funds, as you'll see in the upcoming slide, comes through this one particular area. Final change is the funding for multilingual learners to increase funding over the 6-year period to better reflect costs of providing services for our multilingual learners. These are the 6 areas of change within the foundation budget formula over a 6-year period. FY26 will be the 5th of the 6-year phase-in timeframe. When we put these 3 revenue drivers together, the enrollment increase of 428 students, increases in low-income and multilingual learner enrollments result in a $12.5 million increase. This increase was only $1.3 million last year. The inflation factor applied to the state's foundation budget per pupil rates results in an increase of $12.6 million. In the 5th year phase in the Student Opportunity Act is $17.2 million increase. So overall, I think as Colin pointed out, these factors provide a foundation budget increase of $42.3 million for next year. These amounts do include resident charter school and school choice students, and we're going to back that out in a later upcoming slide. So putting all these together, the inflation enrollment changes will provide the $25.1 million increase. The Student Opportunity Act provides almost $17.3 million for a total foundation budget change of $42.3 million for Worcester next year. FY26 is the 5th of the 6-year phase-in of the per pupil rates. In total, for FY26, the Student Opportunity Act provides the district with $17.2 million. Through these first 5 years of the 6-year phase-in, we've received $86.2 million total foundation budget increase in SOA, which is fully on track for the total increase we had expected to receive upon full implementation of the target per pupil rates by next year. And you can see of the $86 million increase, the low-income rates up almost $50 million, and the change in the low-income student count is another $10 million. So a majority of our change has been through the change in the low-income student count and the new phase-in of the low-income rates. So we've got to go from Colin's foundation budget down to our actual operating budget, and we're going to do that there's the $42.3 million. The increases in Chapter 70 state aid and the city contribution increase, totaling an 8% increase for next year. and just to get messy out with a big spreadsheet, but the factor here is we've got to back out the increases in charter school tuition and school choice tuition assessments, which leaves us an operating budget increase of $38.2 million next year. So while the foundation budget goes up $42.3 million, some of that is associated with school choice tuition assessment increases and charter school tuition assessment increases. And so our budget will be going up $38.2 million. So from that $38.2 million, we've got to back away our baseline increases for next year. So estimated salary increases go up $22 million. Health insurance about $2.5 million. Our assessment to the City of Worcester retirement system, $5.1 million. Our contracted, non-district operated, these are contracted transportation providers for out-of-district special education McKinney-Vento students is going up about $1 million. And then all of the non-salary accounts, inflation, $1 million. So that gives us a total estimated cost increase of $31.7 million. As I said, while we don't have a budget gap next year, it only leaves 6.5 of the $17 million Student Opportunity Act increase available for Student Opportunity Act initiatives, or what we're calling our equity resource funding for next year. So traditionally, what we've done as a school district is determine a foundation level of spending, class sizes, number of guidance and school adjustment counselors, number of special education teachers and ESL. And we're using that now as a baseline minimum guaranteed for all students. So we're calling that our foundations of excellence. All schools will be staffed based upon these ratios. So our average class size, K through 12, will be 21:1. That is less than the elementary allowance in the foundation budget for class size. We've targeted the counselor ratio at 250 students to 1. And then you can see the special education elementary inclusion teacher caseloads and ESL caseloads as well. So all schools will be staffed next year based on these ratios. However, new to the district is this resource equity approach, and that's the allocation of people, time, and money to eliminate resource and opportunity gaps for students, right? That's what the Student Opportunity Act was intended to do. And so what we know is research is pretty clear that student achievement gaps are very much tied to student opportunity gaps. And so we'll be using the remaining Student Opportunity Act money over this year and next year to really close opportunity gaps for students. And so we're really excited to see, working with our building principals, their leadership teams, and other district leaders on what this could mean next year, given we only have $6.5 million next year, but it's a build towards, that we can build towards a system that really addresses opportunity gaps for students and to close those. I think, as Jennifer pointed out in her opening remarks, we are very closely monitoring status of federal grants, especially Head Start, the USDA food programs, and our entitlement grant funding, watching that just as closely as all of you are. You may have seen a little more than a week ago, the USDA cut $1 billion of funding. That's impact had about $180,000 reduction in funding for Worcester for the purchase of local foods to support our program. So obviously, this is something we watch every day in terms of funding for through our federal grants. In terms of FY26 planning still to come, as I said, you will see our budget recommendations directly linked to our Student Opportunity Act and strategic plan. We will be making budget adjustments based upon student enrollment. The enrollment shifts that have occurred this year will clearly have some staffing adjustments at schools. Starting with our district foundational staffing, as we said, that foundations of excellence. Looking at new staffing programs and supports that are needed to support our schools, and then implementing this equity-based budget spending. So that's the work that we're currently now doing, is this equity-based budget spending, working with school leaders on what they see as the levers for student achievement. Some key highlights of our schedule to come. May 9th, our budget will be released to the public and go to the school committee. At some point, there will be a joint meeting or hearing with the city council. And then the school committee will officially deliberate budget on June 5th and June 18th. And as you can see, we have a number of presentations still to do with community partners to get their feedback and priorities, as well as I hope there's some time today for anybody interested today to provide that feedback. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Jennifer, and I guess we're going to go to a Q&A with Colin, Viviana, and myself.
Yes, thank you, Brian, and thank you, Colin, for those very thorough presentations. We have a number of questions, and I am going also to that are in the chat. And also, Noe, you have some questions, and going to lob it over to Noe now.
Thanks, Jen. Let me just, I'm not gonna have enough time. Okay, one more. Okay, sorry. A little tech stuff. So we had a couple of questions so far in the chat, and some other questions we wanted to ask. So I think a question for all of you. One person asked, why is the state not looking to fund at the maximum inflation rate of 4.5% this year by not meeting at least the cap in the budget? We're being told the schools aren't valued as much as they should be.
Yeah, this is an interesting one. So in practice, we have this thing where it says, and it was in the Ed Reform Act originally in 1993. It said, no matter what, you can't inflate more than 4.5%. For 30 years, that didn't matter, right? And we never had inflation this high, but then we did during COVID. And so it's just kind of like I was born in the 80s, so it's sort of an 80s vibe of just, we want to make sure that costs never go up more than 4.5%. But that's just not the reality we face. And so the interesting part is what it will do is it will say, when inflation's really, really high, we're going to cap you. But when inflation's low or normal, we're going to give you the full inflation fix. So, I mean, it certainly does not value the schools at as much as they should. It's not that, I mean, when we talk to folks about this, and it would require a state policy change, it would require, our research last year showed that it would be up to $465 million to adjust everybody to what happened during those high inflation years. And nobody is denying that that's the case. Nobody is saying like we shouldn't do it, I think the issue is more, where's the money going to come from? Or like, what's the phase-in schedule? And so just to kind of bring it home a little bit, Senator Robin Kennedy, along with Representative Orlando Ramos, have a bill that would adjust that over the next few years and would catch us up over a few years. So that's the type of thing that you would need to do. I think one of the other things I've heard has been, you know what, nobody wants to address that problem until we have a commission to study it for the next 2 or 3 years. And as much as I love commissions to study stuff, we kind of knew immediately as soon as inflation was 7 and the cap was 4.5, we knew exactly what the implications were. And so I'm as much as I again love studying things in depth, I mean, we kind of know what all the factors are, and it's just a matter of working together through the state budget to fix it and come up with a plan over the next couple of years. And so one of the things about the potential ideas, one of them is, okay, if official inflation is only 1.9, but we missed 6 points collectively over those 2 years, let's fix it by moving up to that cap in the years where it's low. That's a perfectly reasonable way to get it done. So I won't go totally into the details of how exactly that would work, but it's something that, as I mentioned, would if the SOA funds went from 6 million that's expected this year that Brian just talked about to 31 million because we fixed inflation, that's a whole different ballgame as far as providing after school staffing, getting programs in place. And I think people can manage it now, but we really, the end goal is that we want whether you're born in Worcester, whether you're born in Wellesley, to have the great quality of education. So it's really, it's less of a research issue and it's more of a, political will and where do we come up with the money type of question.
Brian, do you want to comment on the difference between the amount that's being um, the inflation rate as determined by the state and the sort of increased costs that the district's actually facing that you have to accommodate using SOA funding?
Sure. And if I can just first piggyback on Colin's statement, because I think he was a little modest there. I think Mass Budget and MTA came out with their proposal last year. This exactly what he said is we recognize the 4.5% cap and leave it a cap, but if there's carryover, just carry that forward until it's made up. And I know Mary Keefe, who's on this call, was very supportive of that last year. And so that's a conversation to have going forward: is how do we make up that missed opportunity? But in terms of, the inflation factor that the state uses is the same inflation factor that's been used since day one of the foundation budget. We can argue maybe during this study, Colin, we can just study if that's the actual right index to be used, because it's a measure of state and local government actual spending. It's not a measure of a basket of goods. And so by saying that is, if government spending is going to go down, that's going to make the inflation factor go down, but it's not really a reflection of inflation, if you get what I'm saying. So we've got to live within those parameters. We've lived within those parameters for the 30 plus years, but as Colin says, we've never really experienced an inverse of our costs being the inflation being so high, but the inflation factor not matching that, as we have so acutely in the last couple of years. So it's really come to the forefront since COVID, as we're dealing with super high inflation, but the foundation budget not keeping up with those costs. And as you can see, we need to use our SOA increases just to, really cover our inflationary costs. That's really wasn't the intent of SOA. This was really supposed to make a significant change in those opportunity gaps for students. It took us the first 4 years just to cover some basic holes before we can actually get to the Student Opportunity Act leverage points. And now we're using Student Opportunity Act money to cover inflation. That wasn't the intent.
Thank you, Brian. So it's and so from what I'm hearing from the two of you, to the degree that there is any kind of discussion, research commission, however the state chooses to go, if they go that way, that's a place that advocates in the community could try to leverage to get the message across about the needs. And at the same time, I'm hearing from you, Colin, that there's some specific legislation out now that's already been submitted to try to address the short term, the immediate problem, and that's something else that community advocates could support.
Yeah, and just one quick history lesson. I mean, we did the last time we did a commission, it was 2015 it was published, and then it was 2019 that any legislation to deal with it was passed. So that's 4 years, and then an additional 7 years, fiscal 27, for those changes to be fully phased in. So I just want to be really upfront with people that those things kind of take time, and the things that students are missing now because of not adjusting certain things, those are kind of ongoing. So we have to kind of have the appropriate sense of urgency. And then, as I mentioned, the approach now is, okay, we're not going to fully deal with this inflation thing, but we're going to put some more money into transportation and special education in some of those areas. And that's maybe a better solution than nothing, but we don't want to lose sight of the of fixing the structure. And again, personally, I don't, what I'm worried about is, let's say we take another 4 years to study this issue, then it takes another 6 years to phase that in. We're telling people like, hey, remember, it's fiscal 2032. Remember back in fiscal 2022, and no one's even going to remember. So we have to kind of make sure that we don't miss the boat on solving this, particularly when there's 25 million at stake for Worcester.
Thank you for both emphasizing the urgency and the time frame we're looking at. The sooner we get started on this, the sooner accomplishments can be made. We had a very specific question, Brian, that I think looked at one of the slides information in that sort of big spreadsheet on progress of Student Opportunity Act funding phase-in. Someone asked why there was such a drastic difference in the special ed funding from FY24 to FY26. It was 625 to 317, 655,000, 317,000. Do you have that? Do you have any sense of why that amount differed that much?
I'd have to look at that's a good question. I'll have to look at the numbers. I'll have to look at this. I'll have to unpack that. I can get an answer to you guys to distribute out.
That would be great. That would be great. Thank you. So one person asks, what can you do to ensure this, or what will you do to ensure, I think this is directed at the district, what will you do to ensure that the city pays the full amount they owe, as well as the amounts that they underpaid in the past? Additionally, what are you doing to advocate for funding above the minimum from the city? So let me turn that to you, Brian.
Yeah, so superintendent and city manager and their teams meet frequently to discuss not only the foundation, but the general fund budget, but capital spending as well. So we're in constant conversation with the city manager, his team over funding. And so we did have a shortfall in net school spending over the last couple of years, but the city provided us $7.6 million of free cash this year, which kind of caught us up to the backlog of where the city was kind of fell short. Now, the city didn't fall short on purpose. The city fell short because of a number of factors. Number one, we saw a significant increase in McKinney-Vento homeless transportation, which doesn't count for net school spending. So while the city gave us money that was intended for spending on education, we had to spend it on a different area. So it wasn't, the city didn't do something intentionally to short us. So the challenge is when you budget right at the minimum, those are things that are going to occur, that you're going to be either slightly above or slightly below each and every year as, you know, unexpected costs come up. So all I can say is we have frequent conversations with the city manager and his team to advocate for the budget, operating budget and capital budget for the Worcester Public Schools.
Just a sort of follow up to that to Colin and Viviana, if she wants to jump in too. Look, what arguments do you think parents or community advocates could make to encourage the city to increase local funding contributions to education in the way some of the other districts do?
Colin, I'm going to just take a little bit there because and then you can just provide additional ideas. So in mass budget, we advocate at the state level. We don't work specifically in the city space. Having said that, I think that the arguments that we present to the state are very similar that others can present to the city. So when we work in advocacy, in what we use in the advocacy space is hardcore data. So everything that you have seen that Colin has showed to you in terms of the analysis of the budget, we also bring ideas of revenue. So while we have increasing needs of funding programs and services in the state of Massachusetts, we also need revenue lines. And I have said many, many times that Massachusetts is a fiscally conservative state in the sense that it continues to advocate for giving tax breaks to the richest people, and that it was an uphill battle to work and try to pass the Fair Share Amendment, and it actually went to the ballots. It was the people and the voters, the one that passed a constitutional amendment to be able to make more investments into education. And I am proud to say that I work for the organization, which is Mass Budget, that that projected the exact amount that the fair share was going to bring, which is $2 billion, when the state was projecting about 1.5 and budgeted for 1.3, and then we have now a surplus. So how do you, and there is a surplus of about $1.2 billion that people can advocate. So I think that education about how the budget works, when do people can intervene, how do you talk to your legislators, how do you ask them to address in terms of policy more investments like adjusting for inflation, or that the fair share is used as it is intended to be used for services and in the operation of the education system, but also in the additional funding that we have, how it is that is going to be investing in the state in capital investment with the surplus. So while I'm not going to give you a recipe of how to advocate for the city, I can tell you that who distributes the fund, the big chunk of money, is the state of Massachusetts and is the legislature. So Colin, do you want to just...
Yeah, I think it's, I think we want everybody to stretch and do their part. And certainly it's always concerning if we ever see a city below its minimum, again, not like just a tiny bit because of, variance and, unexpected things a little bit here or there. But when we see a city really going under its minimum, that definitely gets my attention. And usually I get some angry emails from that city about what's going on. So I think we do want to be aware of that, but we also have to be realistic that, Worcester doesn't have the capacity that a Cambridge or something has. So Cambridge is a bad example because it's spending like private school levels on its public schools. But there's different capacity. We want to be realistic, but also stretch a little bit. And then it's certainly now the case that with SOA, with the Student Opportunity Act, a few years in, we want to see like, just as Brian presented, here's the specific things we're going to do with these new expansion dollars. And it should show up in, here's the way we're going to be able to expand maybe pre-K or after school or enrichment. We know Worcester Tech is one of the most fantastic in-district vocs in the entire state, and it can hold up against any. Like I couldn't help myself when I was in the city. I went to do a site visit at Worcester Tech, and I saw the students doing veterinary operations and offering a free clinic to community members. And those are the types of things that you can show our programs were able to do with the funding invested in, and we should be this is something we can probably work on together where, districts who want to can show, hey, here's a little bit of what we were able to do with this. And each district does have to submit a plan for how it's going to use its SOA funds every year. So we should invest, and we should make sure that those things are part of I'm sure folks here know and are part of that robust conversation that of like where we most want to see the investment. So I think those are the ideas. I mean, these are not radical ideas. It's, you have big expectations of what we want to get done. And, the big innovation of ed reform in Massachusetts was we're going to have very high standards. We're going to say that we want all our kids to be successful in their career and in their education. But the crazy idea we tried was actually provide funding for the schools to meet those demands. And so it's not exactly rocket science. And I do think, we're going to be tested a little bit, as Brian mentioned. There was this really innovative idea to cut the local funding that school districts can use to buy produce to have fresh food in their schools. Like, that's a really innovative idea. It's a terrible idea. So there are going to be things where we're going to have to stretch a little bit. And as a state and as communities say, no, we're not going to, and actually, I love site visits. I went to Leominster to see the community-based farms that were selling food to the Leominster Public Schools based on the federal grants. So we're going to have to come up with ways that we make up some of those gaps. And as Viviana said, we are absolutely leaning to the fact that the people who have done the best in this economy, who have captured a lot of the growth in the economy at the very, very top, they're going to have to pay their fair share. They're not going to be allowed to use kind of schemes to move money around and not pay their taxes, because things like investing in our schools, investing in roads, bridges, healthcare, housing, those things are too important to not invest in. And so we're leaning into that. And the fact that I guess probably one of the first bills that they'll do in DC is a massive tax cut for the wealthiest corporations and individuals. That has our attention as well, although we work with partners at the federal level. We're keeping an eye on that. So I think it'll be very hard to make the case that those individuals don't have the ability to pay their fair share of taxes here in Massachusetts when they're about to get a tax cut that, at least from 2017's experience, about 85% of it went to the very, very top. And so we don't have to do things that way. Although I do think we are responding and defending against what we're doing, we also have to stay on offense in the sense that we will implement our values here in Massachusetts and show that it can work.
So I just want to share a comment from the chat that I think is relevant to this discussion. One of the participants wrote, I understand that the wheels of government move slowly. However, our students need the legislature to find the political will to fund schools appropriately. That's what the Fair Share Amendment was designed to help. I know that additional funds could be added in if there was a political will. So I just wanted to share that with folks. I thought that was relevant to this. So one question for you, Brian. How are the individual school budgets developed, sort of building off of the sort of the foundation of excellence ratios that you've created?
Yeah, right. So that's what we're working through. Kind of new for us this year is what's the lever that is needed for the individual school to improve student achievement? And maybe it's different for schools. Maybe there's a common answer for, groups of schools. That's the process we're going through now. So all schools will get their foundations of excellence, but now we want to differentiate on equity based on what the schools actually need.
So that's where this equity-based budgeting process is going to be kicking in terms
Yes.
of those determinations.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. And how could parents or community members best participate in this process? What are their entry points to this?
I think there's a couple of entry points. I think if there's a connection they have with individual schools, having conversations with the schools through site councils and so forth. I think, school committee will have a public budget listening session at some point this spring. Forums like this, we will attend any forum that we're invited to get solicit feedback from community stakeholders. So really, either if there's a connection at the school through the school committee or through these type of forums are probably the most direct way for their voices to be heard.
Wondering, are there other districts for any of you? Are there other districts that are using this approach that you're sort of modeling this after or trying to learn from?
So I realized this when there was actually a national conference that came into Worcester a few years ago, and someone from Brian's team was presenting, and I had to remind people, like, this isn't just not everyone's like breaking everything down this well and like explaining exactly how, like, this was the federal grant that came in, so this is how we're planning for that, and then that's gonna ramp down, so we're gonna ramp this up. So I mean, they've had a really, really strong ability to kind of break all these things apart and show how different parts are going. So it's always a work in progress, but as someone who studies this stuff around the state and around the country, I have to just assure you guys that this is a really, really strong, high performing team that's doing something that is really awesome and that we'd like to see more cities do. It's a really interesting give and take. I mean, that question made me think about is, I think we've kind of gotten into this mindset of like, well, because the Student Opportunity Act helped Worcester so much, we don't want to go, they're already fine, and so we're not gonna, we're gonna have to focus on things that only help smaller districts. But that's really kind of a not it's not the right way to think about it. So for example, one thing I've tried to do is explain to districts that even though, when you do this inflation thing, yes, because of the way our formula works and gives money to the districts that need it, yes, a lot is going to the gateway cities, but there's also 200 other districts that also get funding, and it's actually more than some of these other things that have been tried the last few years. So we have to have those conversations. I know those happen with the legislature. Those happen to just explain that there's ways in which these types of approaches can help everyone. And I think of, who was it? Berlin Boylston, who's in Worcester County. They get a lot more from fixing inflation than they got just from doing the things we did last year. So we have to have those conversations where, instead of focusing on, there's some districts that may get an extra $500 to $1 million from fixing inflation. So I'd like to focus on that and how that may prevent them from having to do like a local property tax vote, as opposed to them looking and saying, oh, well, Worcester got this much, so let's stop the whole train. And so that's the art of this thing. We have to kind of make sure that everybody can is brought along as we do something, even though we know that cities with the lower tax base might need more, and that's something that we kind of are always a part of as we work with the legislature. We are really pushing back against the idea that just because there were some things going on at the same time. We did the Student Opportunity Act, but we also had the greatest inflation since the 70s, and we had $2 billion of federal grants all disappear all overnight. So people are having trouble kind of disentangling those things, but we gotta stay the course of what we're on, and bring folks along as we bring Worcester up. We're also bringing others with you guys.
So no, I'll just add to that, and Colin, thank you for those comments. But certainly we look at other districts and other examples or exemplars that may be out there. We look at research. We kind of know that things like efficacy. We know things like meaning allowing teachers to plan time together, and we've gone through the experience of having level 4 schools and strategies that work, that turned around schools. So we've done the turnaround experience. So we're looking at best practices out there, both through other districts, through research, and then from our own experience. As we like to do, we Worcesterize everything, right? So we're taking all of that and Worcesterizing it to see what would work best in Worcester, based on the available resources, based upon proven techniques that we've done, or proven techniques through research, or what we see other districts doing. So again, we're kind of just unpacking that so we can build towards something in the future years. But we'll plant the seeds in FY26 with the $6.5 million we have available, again drawing upon all of those resources that we've been looking at and talking about and presenting on, and so forth. So this is, we feel, as a start, but we're drawing upon all those experiences and then making it the Worcester way. So
I just want to quickly add that, and I'm sure that Brian is also developing a budget without having all of the information of what is going to happen in the federal government. So when we have been doing the analysis of the state budget and the proposal that the governor submitted, I just put it in the chat if you want to look at our analysis. We have stated in every instance that we do not know the extent of the cuts. We have had, like questions like all of these federal employees that are going to be laid off. Where do they get their unemployment insurance from? And how is that going to affect the unemployment insurance in terms of the funding that they have to be able to support these workers when they are laid off? But we also are aware of severe cuts, as Brian said, in SNAP benefits. We know that Head Start is also in the chopping block, that Section 8 for housing is also being considered for cuts, in a lot of Medicare. So we have been pushing and advocating for the state of Massachusetts to consider other revenue sources. And to also look at at the rainy day fund. So, and Colin can help me with this. The rainy day fund has over $9 billion right now, or close to $9 billion, which is a significant amount of money. And there is this perception that we will only use that fund if we are under a recession. So a lot of advocates are saying that the rainy day fund is when it's raining and it's actually raining. So
Boring.
so the state is going to have to pick up the ticket if we are not going to let our most vulnerable populations to suffer the most. And we are talking about the ability of people to be able to have food, to have where to sleep, to have any place where to leave their kids in terms of childcare, or lose their housing, their subsidized housing. So, you know, I don't think that it is a time to be timid, to request and advocate for the state to generate additional revenue lines, which is not targeting working class or doing regressive taxation, which is just increasing sales tax that usually hurt poor people the most. So we think about, you know, corporate tax, a fair share for corporate tax that mass budget is going to be advocating for, and that we expect, if this is passed, to increase revenue, hundreds of millions of additional revenue for Massachusetts, and using also the rainy day fund. So this is a difficult time, and these are extreme times, and I think it requires extreme measures. And if Massachusetts wants to continue to be the state that has values in equity, diversity, inclusion, and supporting the most vulnerable populations, and being a welcoming state for those that have had to leave their countries for terrible conditions, I think that this is the time to show it. Colin, if you want to just talk about what we've been pushing for.
Yeah. The numbers are spot on. Yeah. So we have one of the top 5 largest rainy day funds in the entire country, even though obviously we're not the largest state. So that's available to us for a rainy day. And of course, the definition of what that's going to mean is going to be determined. And so we are, you know, one of the things, as Viviana mentioned, we have this there's a loophole where basically corporations can assign a bunch of the profits they make in the United States, move them to tax havens like the Cayman Islands, and for, you know, to avoid taxes. And we're going to be working on that. And again, just trying to level the playing field, because obviously local businesses in Worcester cannot move their profits over to some subsidiary in Luxembourg or the Cayman Islands to avoid taxes. And so it's about kind of fairness, and it's about what we need to do together. And as we said, we're gonna, you know, we're preparing for some pretty, I mean, we're preparing for some unpredictable things. Like certainly there's been some surprises. Like who knew that you could have funds lawfully appropriated by Congress that all of a sudden an administration can say, we're going to go ahead and stop that, even though that's clearly the realm of another branch. That's a little bit of a surprise, but we'll see what happens. And then other things we kind of did expect. If we go back to what happened in prior years, when you have a regressive tax cut at the federal level that gives tons of funding to or tons of tax breaks to the wealthiest individuals and corporations, inevitably what that means is what you've seen proposed in some of the federal budgets, where you're cutting healthcare and food aid and all these things by hundreds of billions of dollars in order to make the math work. And so we don't support that, and so we're going to be prepared to use all the tactics available to us and there's going to be certain things where there may be attempts to you know, we see them already, attempts to put us in a bind and say, well, you can have this federal money, but to get it, you're going to need to do something that violates your values. And that's going to be a very critical time. And well, we're not going to be able to fight every single battle, to be honest. But we will have to pick some very important ones. And I think discriminating against students based on their background is not something that we're going to accept. It's not something that we're going to do. And that we're going to, we have the ability to fight in some ways. That one of the ironies of this is that Massachusetts and other states that are more progressive actually have more capacity to make up for federal cuts than some of our countrymen and our friends and relatives in other states that have been less progressive in the past. So, but these are these are very unusual times, and I think unfortunately some of our friends and countrymen in other parts of the United States will realize that these things mean you're cutting away from your own schools, and maybe gravity is real, and people will realize that's not a good idea. But we'll have to see.
No, if I can Worcesterize that conversation
Yes.
a little bit too. So, just to give context, we receive about $52 million in federal funding. So our entitlement grants, which is Title I, II, III, and IV. And then if somebody wants to let the Secretary of Education know that IDEA stands for the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, that's one of the grants as well. It funds, so the entitlement grants funds teachers and paraeducators, fund a little over 500 positions. So it's about 10% of our revenue and about 10% of our staffing. So funds the entire Head Start program, and also funds the entire USDA, the school nutrition program, all the employees, and the 5 million meals we serve a year.
Thanks for that context, Viviana and Colin. Thanks for bringing up the issue of federal funding. That's actually a question I was going to ask. So you jumped in and answered it before I could even ask, which is good because we are out of time at this point. So let me just actually close my part with a comment by Kirsten Fraser, who made the comment that I quoted before. Building on what Viviana said, the legislature needs to get the message that it's not just raining, we're heading into a hurricane. So with that, I'll turn it back to Jennifer to close us.
Okay, thank you all. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to the panelists for your very thoughtful comments, your very thoughtful presentations. We have a lot of work to do ahead of us. As Noe said, this is not a rainstorm, this is a hurricane. And we need to hew towards our values and think about how we value education, how we value our children, and how we want to shape the future that they will be a part of. So thank you all for being here. There will be the recording of our event will be on our website in the next couple of days. So thank you all and have a good evening.
Thanks everyone for showing up. Thanks to the presenters.
Thank you,
Dan. Thank you,
Diane.
thank you, Diane. Thank you, Gerard. Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, Noe. Okay.
Thank you, Jen. I'm going to sign off now.
Okay, see you later then.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.